Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. I'm sorry about the delay in getting started today. We're having some technical challenges, but it's really a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation, taking it to the streets, Navalny, the Kremlin, and popular protest in Russia. I'm going to start off by introducing two of the three colleagues. The third will join us separately in a moment. My hope is that everyone who's watching will be able to participate by submitting questions to us via Google. So please, we'll be keeping an eye on the Google chat bar, and I hope that people will start dropping in questions. We're joined right now by two colleagues based in Moscow. The first is Andrei Kolesnikov, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center and one of our most attentive observers of Russian domestic politics. We're also joined by Elizaveta Fokht, who is a correspondent for BBC's Russian service and is also, again, someone who follows Russian domestic political developments very closely and was in Moscow last weekend during the protests in central Moscow. In a few moments, as soon as we resolve some technical obstacles, we're going to be joined, I hope, by Alexei Navalny, who's another senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center. This conversation is taking place on the eve of what is expected to be more demonstrations in Moscow this weekend. I'm just to get us started, I'm curious if, Lisa, maybe if you could describe what you witnessed in central Moscow last weekend, and specifically what was different. We've seen large-scale protests in Russia off and on. The most recent round of demonstrations of this scale, I believe, were in August of 2019. That was before the pandemic. But I'm curious in terms of the kind of people who were there and what you think motivated them to come out. What do you think was different or new in this most recent wave?
Hello. First of all, thanks for having me. I definitely saw some similarities with the protest I covered before that, but I certainly saw something new. First, let me start with that this is all happening in the time of COVID-19. So, of course, everything is different for everyone. And, of course, for protesters, for Navalny, for the government. And it's very interesting that now the organizers of this protest are being persecuted for violating public hygiene rules, right? Not for causing mass disturbances, but for this new via this new sanitary legislation. It's very important because it's much easier to prove that Navalny is spreading the virus, especially given the fact that Russia has suffered a lot because of COVID, than to prove that he's backed by the CIA and State Department and that he caused mass disturbances. Second thing I want to say is that there are, a lot of talks in the media domestically and internationally that more young people than usual participated in the protest. This, to be honest, doesn't match with my observation. I saw a lot of young people, but I wouldn't say that that students or children, that they were the core of the crowd. I don't know. I think we had it was widely discussed that we saw this a protest wave in Russian TikTok, which is mostly used by children, but it feels at least this is how I feel about it, that TikTokers mostly stayed in TikTok. They didn't show up, which is, I think, very important. Third thing, I want to say that, of course, we saw some repressions before and after the rally. A crackdown like this is not unprecedented. This is what usually happens before and after every major protest. But now, Russia has more tools to persecute people and investigate things because of legislation adopted last year. Because last year, Russia increased punishments for many violations related to protest activities. We're talking about disruption of the road traffic, about, incitement, mass disturbances. We're talking about, those public hygiene rules, of course. So this is something they can now use to persecute people. The primary target of those repressions are still Navalny and his team. It's very important to understand that. It's still them who face most of this pressure, night interrogations, night searches, that kind of, I don't know, some people would call it harassment or persecution. Yeah. But repressions are, without any doubts, always, and specifically today, target average people who happen to be sometimes in the wrong place in the wrong time. It especially applies to people who are suspected of, assaulting police or law enforcement officers. Right now, everyone's talking about the story of this TikTok blogger. There's not, much politics in his blog, but apparently he took part in the rally and kicked a government car. One of the most shocking episodes of this rally. And in Russia, it's almost impossible to get acquitted with the charges of assaulting police officers. So this guy is in trouble. Another hero of this protest is this lady in St. Petersburg who got kicked in the stomach and ended up at hospital with a concussion. And the guy who did this to her came to this hospital and said, sorry, but this is the best she can get. And now actually she's being investigated. What she was doing there, like her children are under investigation. And it's also, very important to think about that. Another issue, this is not something new, but people discuss it today too, is that undercover police agents are they usually attend rallies and film everything. So if you're involved in any kind of clashes or something like this, you never know if it was filmed or if it was filmed by just, by media, and investigators will see it and decided to press charges against you. So you never know in Russia. Another thing is police violence. Police violence is not riot police violence. I'm talking about riot police violence. It's not something new for Russia. I'd say that police violence at the rally didn't expect my expectation and its usual level, according to what I saw. I'm only talking about my impressions. But this time, some of the protesters, I'm not talking about all of them, but I don't know, dozens of protesters, maybe a few dozens of protesters, were ready to push back, to fight back. And clashes, and we definitely saw some clashes, this is something new for police. And you could tell that they were incredibly confused with this, with, with the snowballs flying from the crowd, with people, again, fighting back. And this is why that's new for them. They were confused, and we should keep that in mind before the next demonstration, because we don't know how they will react next time, especially given the fact that the protest is scheduled to happen in front of the FSB building, right? In front of their headquarters. And the last thing I want to say is that, of course, the participation, was very wide. We saw protests in more than 100 cities across Russia. But in Moscow, I think the most, positive estimation that around 40,000 showed up. Given the fact that Navalny's expose about the so-called Putin Palace was watched over 100 million times, right? We can definitely say that this level of attention still doesn't necessarily convert into participation in the streets. And another last thing I want to mention is that protest, I think, showed that self-organization is not something we can expect from average Russian people, because people, didn't gather after Navalny was poisoned, or when Putin introduced those constitutional amendments, right? The story of the last year, or even after he published this investigation about the alleged FSB involvement in the attempt of his life. We didn't see, I don't know, like a huge crowd in front of the FSB or something. And we can say for sure that this protest happened. Of course, Navalny's arrest was a huge trigger, and we can surely see a huge discontent with what's going on. But Navalny's team had to call for that, had to create, like Facebook and Kontakte events to attract people. And this is what happened before, and this is what happened this time. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Lisa. So, Andrei, let me try to bring you into the conversation and also try to widen the lens of this discussion. In your work as a scholar at Carnegie, you've done a lot of work with public opinion data, focus group data, and you've tried to give us a sense. We're now joined by Alexander Baunov, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center. Your timing is impeccable, Sasha. But before we turn to you, Sasha, let me ask Andrei. There is a bigger context, and I'm glad that Elizaveta Fokht just used the word trigger. And what we're seeing in the public mood reflects not just what everyone knows from reading the newspaper in the West, which is there's this palace, there's a viral video, there's young people protesting in different Russian cities, and a cross section of Russian society is on the streets. But there's a lot of public unhappiness about socioeconomic conditions. We've seen real incomes down by about 10% or 13% since 2013. There's a loss of faith in the future that conditions will continue to improve. There's a loss of excitement about the anti-Westernism and the sort of after effects of the annexation of Crimea. And there's a real sort of big mass of public opinion that is not politicized and that is basically either apathetic or disengaged or basically not energized by the fact that a major political opposition leader was the target of an assassination attempt. There's only a very, at least according to the public opinion data, only a very small section of Russian society believes that Navalny was the target of an assassination attempt. And most people believe, it seems, or at least tell pollsters, they believe the official line, which is that nothing happened, right? That this is not, that this wasn't an attack on Navalny using chemical nerve agent. So anyway, so can you talk a little bit about putting these protests in the context of bigger public opinion trends and whether we're seeing a trigger event that might challenge the legitimacy of the government or undermine its hold on power? Andrei.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, do you hear me?
We do.
Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. So yes, really, 55% of Russians do not trust reports that Navalny was poisoned. It's a huge figure. 47% find it difficult to say who may have been behind the scene of this poisoning. It means that people do not involved strongly into the story. There were no incentives or triggers to go to the streets after the poisoning of Navalny. Not to mention the very important thing, I mean a generation gap between young people, sociological category 18-24, and people, elder groups of people like 55 plus, 65, and so on and so forth. So these people they have a different vision of the world, different vision of events, different vision of the future of Russia. It means that Navalny has changed something in this perception, because so many people tried to understand what has happened with him after his returning to the country, after his arrest, during his arrest, and especially after the film about so-called Putin's Palace, with 100 million watchers of this movie. I must say that viewing time was almost 39 million hours. It's also serious. And it was the incentive for people who were not politicized to go to the streets. But these people were ready to be politicized. We are talking about advanced classes, especially in the cities, urban, well-educated, more or less well-educated class, middle classes, maybe even lower middle classes in regions. And these meetings were geographically expanded. This is a very important thing. This is not only protest in the capital, in Moscow or in St. Petersburg. These cities are traditionally very active in terms of protests. And one more thing, socially apathical groups, which were considered as a social base for this regime, they were involved this summer into the protests in Khabarovsk. The incentive was the arrest of so-called People's Governor Sergei Furgal. It was a violation of constitutional rights of people for their choice, for their electoral rights. And it was the protest of the civil society, not of political opposition. Navalny is the most recognizable figure in a political opposition, maybe the only one. He has rating of trust, rating of approval, and he's more or less popular among people who are politically engaged. But now he became the symbol of the resistance of the civil society. And apathical people are coming into the group of active citizens, into the civil society from simpler society. It means that Navalny has a new quality. He became not only politician, but he became a moral force. I can compare him with let's say, Sakharov or somebody else in Soviet history, but we can compare the moral force of these people, of these fighters with the regime. So in that sense, this is a little bit a new situation, but we must avoid euphoria, because we can't wait the change of regime because of these events. We can't wait for strongly prolonged protests. We can't wait for changing power because of streets protests. The regime is still stable, and this is a full-scale authoritarian regime which is ready to pursue a line of force, just like in Belarus. It is more or less comparable, but there are some nuances in it. So it means that yes, here is a new situation with the public opinion in Russia, but it is not enough to change dramatically the situation in Russia.
Thanks, Andrei. So, Alexander Baunov, you had an article that was published on Sunday night about what I would characterize as the elite reaction to the protests. And part of what has kept Putin in power for 20 years is, in Russian, this term, the lack of an alternative. Basically, there is no one on the playing field with his stature or symbolic rallying point for anti-Putin sentiment. But by arresting him, by trying to kill him, you argued in your article, in some ways, Russian authorities have now turned him into the world's, I think you used the phrase, most famous political prisoner. And I'm curious if what we've seen in the last century or 120 years has always been that it's when there's a split inside the Russian elite and the Russian leadership that major change has occurred. I'm curious if you believe that what's happening right now is leading to those kinds of splits where there's a certain segment of the Russian elite for whom what is being done right now is either at best short-sighted and counterproductive, or at worst, a line has been crossed that people can't accept, or is it what Andrei was just saying, that this is it's a mature authoritarian system and people are not likely to break in a fundamental way in at least their tolerance of the existing political order as a result of what's happening?
Well, as you say, it happened in the past. The Russian regimes, different regimes, before the revolution, after the revolution, and now, created their main enemies with their own hands by applying repressions and increasing the moral authorities of their own enemies, of their own opponents. Alexei Navalny, 10 years already, is struggling not only against Vladimir Putin. He is struggling for the position of the undisputable leader of Russian opposition, of its main face and of its main name. And after this murder attempt that happened last summer, he finally achieved this position he was searching for years. He is much less controversial for all those who are not satisfied with the continuation, eventually long life continuation of Putin's rule with this mature authoritarian regime, as you put it. And he really became, from one of the Putin's critics, from one of the opposition leaders, to some of the leader, maybe more leader, maybe not, but some of the leader of Russian civil society. That's true. And in the Russian establishment and the Russian ruling elite, there is an understanding that this murder attempt, this poisoning, helped Navalny to be promoted to the high he haven't achieved before. So there is a discussion, of course, on the Hitler ground. It is not public, but we have signs of it, and it's very understandable discussion about what to do next to keep Navalny on this almost legendary mythological height, or to ease the situation with releasing him free from the jail. Because after the poisoning, after his courageous return to Russia, and after his arrest, he became kind of political prisoner number one. The current Russian regime lacked the name of Putin's enemy, Putin's opponent, that is well known all around the world. So to ease the situation, of course, is the interest of those who want to keep, who want to preserve more or less normal relations and contacts with the Western governments, with the new coming American administration, for instance. So there's a more political part and politically technological part of the Kremlin, of the ruling elite, and those who are for the more brutal methods and more direct ways to eliminate, to get rid of the enemy. It's, of course, the law and order bodies and special services. For them, what is important is to silence the annoying critic, to silence the annoying oppositioner who has this network in the regions, who has this tool of smart voting, who can influence the result of Duma election of this year. And for those who are more flexible and politically minded, of course, they would prefer to play more complicated game.
Thank you, Alexander. Lisa, can we talk? It hasn't gotten as much attention in the West. We are distracted by things like the arrival of a new US president, obviously. But right now, the plan for Sunday, just turning to what's likely to happen in the next 48 hours, is that the Navalny team is calling for a second wave of demonstrations in central Moscow. They have identified as the gathering place for these demonstrations the building, the historic longtime headquarters of the KGB, now the FSB, in central Moscow on Lubyanka Square, as well as the square directly opposite what we would call normally the Kremlin, but it's basically where the president's staff works, the presidential administration. It's the former Central Committee complex of the Communist Party. I'm curious, those are not places that you can fit huge numbers of people, and they are obviously very sensitive locations in the eyes of the authorities. Is this a move that you think will raise the temperature potentially and create the possibility of clashes or provocations? What do you think is the strategy that's driving the Navalny team to move groups of people into this part of town, which is going to be very different part of town than last weekend, where the authorities have been pretty experienced for the last 10 years at dealing with crowds in front of the square that was used last weekend?
Well, it's really hard to predict what we're, going to see this weekend. It's really hard to predict. But look, one thing we should keep in mind is, even though the Kremlin is obviously very uncomfortable with what's going on, the Kremlin has much more options than Navalny and generally the opposition right now. The Kremlin and the so-called Siloviki, they can calibrate the level of violence and prosecutions, right? They're ready to show. They have so many options about what they can do to Navalny. They can send him to prison. They can they can put him under house arrest because of this investigation of the alleged embezzlement which happened in Navalny's fund, right? And the opposition doesn't really have any options but to call for more protests. And it's hard for me to say what's in their head, but it feels that like bringing people to the FSB and the administration is for them is a way to bring it to another level, symbolically, and maybe they hope that it will bring more international attention, more media attention to this matter. But to be honest, it's also very important to understand that there are, very few places where a really huge crowd can gather in the center of Moscow, probably Manezhnaya Square, which is in front of the Kremlin, is a place like that. But it's impossible to gather them without permission from the authorities. And in Russia, let me remind you, you have to seek permission. I remember about this, but maybe our audience doesn't remember about this. That you actually have to seek permission to gather, to hold a rally. And of course, those protests, the last protest, the protests we're about to see, they're considered by the state to be illegal, and no one will ever give permission to protest against Putin in front of the Kremlin. This will never happen. But the last spot, Pushkinskaya Square, I don't think it was very comfortable for Navalny and the organizers to have people there either, because it's very small and it's blocked easily. So again, I can't we can't really describe their motivation because we just don't know. We were not involved in those discussions, but the fact that it will bring everything to another level, I think this is something we can say for sure.
So, Andrei, can you talk a little bit about the ability of the authorities to portray their opponents as un-Russian and as acting at the direction of foreign governments? You know, there's a certain side of this that when you hear it sounds like a bad joke, right? The man who's been targeted for death is not operating as a foreign agent. He's acting as someone who was nearly killed and is now willing to come back to Russia and challenge the government to, who's put his life, at risk voluntarily. But what's striking, and this came up in some discussions by a Russian leading pollster, Lev Gudkov, in recent days, is only about 15% of Russians believe that Navalny was the target of an assassination attempt. And there are a series of new public announcements by the authorities about the idea that it's foreign intelligence services and these foreign agents who are, doing things to destabilize Russia, as opposed to a legitimate grassroots response to the state's behavior. I'm just curious, can you talk a little bit about why these tools are still, they're not a joke, they actually are somewhat effective?
Yes, it's an important angle because since the annexation of Crimea, the main feeling which has been created by the authorities was the feeling of a besieged fortress for Russians. The West is attacking us in different fields, in the field of diplomacy, in the field of political issues, in the field of our culture, in the field of everything, and economically as well. So we must defend our borders. And the most popular politicians at that very period were the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, and the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, because they defended our borders in different fields. So after that, there was worsening of the situation, worsening of perception of the world among very huge groups of people. They became the supporters of different kind of conspiracy theories. This is a time of growing popularity of Stalin and historical nostalgia for order in Stalinist era. It means that Putin is not Stalinist enough in that sense. He can't contribute normal order. And at the end of the day, we have the theories that behind the scenes there are some foreign agents. Behind the scenes there are CIA agents, and Navalny is the agent of this kind. Putin said about it several times publicly for a big audience. So, and here is the result: fresh figures of the Elizaveta Center. Almost half of Russians, 48%, believe that the point that foreign agent laws, new legislation on foreign agents, is to protect Russia from Western interference. And at the same time, 30% they follow the opinion that these innovations are adopted in order to limit opportunities to criticize the government. Here is a split in the society between the supporters of foreign agents theory and normal people. And this is the battle in the minds of people between normal, modern understanding of the world and a very archaic and non-modern vision of processes in the world. And Navalny is at the side of modernization and normalization of the country, and Putin is at the side of tradition, at the side of our glorious history, at the side of state. State as a main player, for instance, in the economy as well. So this is we must see the processes through the lenses of not only political but cultural and economic processes. if you have a monopoly in a political sphere, you will have a monopoly in an economic sphere. And we are living in the conditions of the state capitalism, with a lot of interventions of the state into the economy. And at the end of the day, we have price regulations. This is not joke. This is new steps by the so-called technocratic government of Mishustin. So in that sense, this is a picture of existential battle between modern vision of the world and traditional conservative vision of the world.
Thanks. I'm glad you brought up this sort of international context. I wanted to turn to Alexander Baunov to talk about this a bit. It's no secret that the new U.S. President Joseph Biden takes a very different line on Russia than Donald Trump did. It's no secret that he's talked a lot about the need to promote democracy again, after all the problems, particularly inside the United States, but other Western democracies, that there's a moment to reinitiate and reinvigorate democratic behavior at home, and as well to engage to support democratic partners overseas. There's been a lot of talk about sanctions and making Russia pay a price. So the idea that Russia used a nerve agent to try to kill someone like Alexei Navalny, there's a moment where I think we're waiting to hear what the new administration will do in terms of possible new sanctions. What do you think, if you had to sort of think about the Kremlin's likely response to the building up of expectations of a tougher US approach and a more unified US-European response? After many years where Trump divided the West, it's clear that Biden will seek to unify the response. Is the Russian government response likely to involve preemptive efforts to disrupt whatever Biden is planning, to sort of make it less possible for those efforts to succeed? Or is it better to do what we were talking about in terms of the strategy with Navalny, where you just kind of want to wait everything out and time is on the Kremlin side? What do you think is the likely approach if those are the two choices that the Kremlin is facing?
Well, first, in Russia, there's a very widespread feeling among the average citizens of the foreign conspiracy against Russia. When the Soviet Union was in dissolution, nobody supported this country here. But when it was over, after this trauma of dissolution of the country, the people started to find who is responsible, and the current government, the Putin's government, is exploiting very successfully this search for the culpable, for the culprits. That's the West that dissolved the country. And everybody remembers that many people remember that at that time, the West supported the pro-democracy slogans, the pro-democracy rhetoric. So now Putin's government hint or just say openly that when the West is supporting pro-democracy rhetoric or pro-democracy activists inside Russia, they are going to dissolve Russia one more time. That's why the support of the and of course the foreign governments are usually support the protesters in Russia and are usually condemning the excessive use of force by the police and other bodies. This time, what we see in Joe Biden administration statement is stronger and more condemning and more supportive for the protesters than usually, and that's clear why, because the Biden administration has to show its difference from the very beginning towards Russia. Trump administration was largely seen as having some deals, secret deals with the Kremlin, or at least President Trump was seen as somebody who avoids criticizing Putin. And that's why Joe Biden started with a very harsh condemnation of the police and of the Russian authorities suppressing another protest, and did it in a very strong word, very supportive words towards the Alexei Navalny, saying that they are shoulder to shoulder with him and they are allies and partners, which can be seen by the Kremlin and its media outlets, so the state Russian media, as another proof that Alexei Navalny and his movement is just a tool to destroy Russia. And because this view is shared by many Russians, the Navalny organization, the Navalny movement itself, haven't promoted very much this. I mean, haven't promoted very much this sign that this show of support from the American administration, provided that Navalny is not appealing for Russian traditional Putin's critic in face of Russian intellectuals, Russian pro-Western intelligentsia, Russian liberals, but he's trying to appeal to a broader base that includes and successfully appeals to a broader base that includes many of those who are in search not only of the pro-Western political turn or democracy or liberal values, but for those who are in search of justice and just better life. And part of this group are Putin's supporters. So when you are appealing to Putin's supporters, you have not to look very much pro-Western, at least for some of them.
Thank you, Alexander. Lisa, can we talk a little bit about, and this is a question that's come in through the Google chat, so I very much hope that people who are watching will continue to use the Google chat. One of the only data points that was being referenced after this weekend was the idea that over 40% of the people who turned out in Moscow had never been to a protest before. And it's a small sample of data, so it's hard to draw too many conclusions. But I'm curious if, one, that matches your impression, that the people who were there were not necessarily the people who have been regularly showing up and appearing in public, even when it's not officially a sanctioned public demonstration. And then two, related to that, you've written in your own work earlier this week about whether we're seeing the recreation of a series of law enforcement actions that will target individuals who have been identified as being involved in the protests and then punishing them very severely in the hope that it sends a message to young people or to other average people that if you show up, there is a real risk that you will be, you'll face a very severe punishment. So I'm just curious if you can sort of look at those two issues together, the level of politicization and the effects of very targeted punitive action by the authorities.
Yeah, they're usually very targeted indeed, but I think the risk is not that, like, if you showed up, you're going to be punished for that. It still takes, something more. If you're suspected of assaulting a police officer, if you threw like a plastic bottle, if you did something like that, the chances are very high that you're going to be prosecuted. And this is what we're seeing now. There are, only in Moscow, we already have several cases of investigation of assaulting police and law enforcement. And this is something that happened before. This is something which is clearly happening now. And for the state, targeting police, law enforcement has always been like a red line, which you cannot cross. The other thing is about 40% of new faces. Of course, it's hard to me, to esteem that, because I didn't have a chance to talk to every protester. But like my feelings that this is something that people say every time major protests are happening. That I've never seen that amount of new faces as in 2012/2016/2019/now. The possible explanation is that since protests in Russia don't necessarily lead to any significant changes, people get involved in this kind of activity and then they get disappointed. And I know many people who used to attend rallies in, let's say, 2017, 2019, but they didn't participate this time because they just don't feel that this will change anything at all. In that sense, I think it's impossible to. It's important to talk about Khabarovsk, because in Khabarovsk we didn't see a huge rally, and for many observers that was surprising, given the protests they had last year after the arrest of their governor Sergei Furgal, who someone calls the people's governor. And the explanation may very well be the same. People spent 4 months protesting his arrest, and he's still in jail. So what's the point of protesting against Navalny's arrest? It's gonna end just like with Furgal. But well, I'm absolutely sure that some people decided to attend for the first time in their lives. That's for sure. I saw, I think, four young children. They looked like they were like 13 or 14, and one of them was shouting to a police officer. That next time your children will show up, but that was an exception. I didn't see a lot of children, even though many people anticipated that, and we saw this again incredible information campaign aiming to prevent children and students, generally young people, from participating. So it's obviously a very important issue for the Kremlin. They obviously try to win young people's hearts, and even my sister, she's 10, and in her school, teachers warn the parents that please don't let your children to participate in the protest. So new faces. That's the issue the Kremlin is following very, very, very closely. But since some people, would say, since we only had 4,000 protesters in the streets, it's just really hard to say whether it's a new wave of protesters, a new generation, or it's a mix of new people and old people, or come to any conclusions whatsoever.
Thanks. So we've sort of been dancing around the divide between the internet and sort of global-oriented population, younger urbanized population, and then the bulk of the Russian population that isn't necessarily looking for information in chat rooms or on social media. I'm curious, Andrei, if you can talk about the impact that technology is having on political attitudes, and whether there's just there's a simplistic assumption that because you're more active on social media, it will push you in a certain direction, or because you watch the YouTube video about Putin Palace that Navalny produced, it will it'll lead to a change in political views. Do you think that logic holds up? I know it's hard to generalize, but I'm curious what you think the effect is of these new non-state controlled platforms and channels of information on public perception.
Really, we were witnesses many years ago of the so-called Facebook revolution and the Arab Spring, and even the Bolotny Square, the events of 2011 and 2012 in Moscow were considered as a Facebook revolution also. But I would say that technologies are only tools for mobilization or for exchanging information between users. This is not the feature of democratization, for instance, because Kremlin and people who are working for FSB, they are also using such a tool as internet and social media smartly. But nevertheless, it found out that this clash between protesters and the state is a clash, in some sense, this is an information warfare, let's say. Where the state side is more or less transparent for investigators and average citizens, but at the same time, the protesters are also transparent for the prosecutors and police and FSB and so on and so forth. But here is one more detail. We are talking about this film about Putin's palace, so-called, and this movie made such a very impressive impact on people's understanding how our elite lives. For some people, this is a dream, maybe, to live like Putin. We are for many years in the circumstances when the elite wants to live like Abramovich and rule like Stalin. And here is one more evidence of it, even if this palace is not Putin's one. But it's interesting that the authority could be frightening, could be terrible, but it can be ridiculous. It found out that it's quite ridiculous how these rich people are living, including Putin, who is a part of elite, who is a part of this unity of bureaucrats and businessmen, big businessmen. So because of that, this is also a new situation, which is a consequence of this technological revolution. The authorities had to go on the defensive. They defended themselves. They explained it themselves. Even Putin was involved in this process. He tried to explain that this is not his palace, not to mention some silly explanations of FSB, that this is no-fly zone because of the activity of the NATO bloc. And spokesman of Kremlin, Peskov, also said that Putin has more votes than there are people in the streets, absolutely incomparable items, and he did it. It was also very silly. So this is new situation. The Kremlin initiated this talk on the TV, official state TV, about Navalny. And this is a great victory of Navalny to be in the screen of millions of Russians who never use the internet, for instance, and who believe to the propaganda. And this is a new period of this, let's say, information warfare between political opposition and civil society, which is much broader than political opposition, and the state.
So I'm conscious of our time. We only have about 3 minutes left. Let me maybe turn to Sasha Baunov for the last question, which is, in the Western discussion about everything that's happened, sanctions are the thing that people always focus on. And the question is, do these kinds of targeted sanctions that are being used to identify people who are possibly responsible or who are believed to be responsible, for example, for the use of Novichok in the attempt to kill Alexei Navalny, what is the way those kinds of moves are interpreted in Moscow? Is it still a badge of honor that opens up, a certain ability to demonstrate loyalty to the regime? Is it an inconvenience that cuts off fun times in the West and you can't travel to go on vacation anymore to the south of France? Is it a tool that promotes division? Or is it more that it's now 7 years of this and it's basically everyone knows basically how to adapt to the Western efforts to put pressure on the regime, and it doesn't change behavior?
Well, many targeted sanctions are aimed at those people who are already living under some restrictions. Those who are members of security services and military agencies and military institutions have already restrictions and officially cannot travel freely abroad, especially to Western countries, NATO countries, cannot possess properties there. Those who are touched and are really scared with the perspective of sanctions are the closest to the West part of Russian elite, so-called system liberals, oligarchs, and high-ranking officials who started their career at 90s when the relations with the West were good, and maybe in the beginning of 2000 as well. They have properties, they have some interests. I'm sorry, they have some interest in the West. Oh. That's the dog. They have some interest in the. Stop it.
This is going to be the viral part of our presentation.
Yeah. They have some interest in the West, and I'm sorry.
The dog is protesting.
Yes, absolutely, but I don't know against what. They have interest in the West, and they have. I have to do something with it. No. They have children in the West, and basically they have direct contacts with the elites in the West. And sanctions aimed at these people are sensitive for these people. And Alexei Navalny is trying to promote sanctions, exactly targeted sanctions, not only against those who belong to security agencies and other people, but those who are members of this more sophisticated and more flexible, and even we can say more pro-Western part of Russian elite.
Okay. Well, look, I'm conscious of the time. I really appreciate everyone who's joined us and watched online. I'm grateful to Sasha's dog for finally.
I'm really sorry for it.
Joining us at the
Voice
end.
of America.
He didn't know he's participating in the international discussion.
And it's really been an honor to host Elizaveta Fokht. I encourage everyone to follow her on Twitter and to look at her reporting online on the BBC Russians website, and to my colleagues Alexander Baunov and Andrei Kolesnikov for joining us. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.